The VCS conversion of Atari's biggest arcade hit has arrived in today's Atari archive. Atari had been pursuing home conversions of its biggest arcade hits from the very start with the VCS. After all, according to engineer Joe DeCure, the original VCS prototype was developed alongside rudimentary takes on Tank and Jet Fighter, and that trend continued on in subsequent years with conversions of games like Night Driver, Breakout, and Missile Command. And that brings us to August 1981's Asteroids, a hotly anticipated port of Atari's most successful arcade game. For those unfamiliar, Asteroids is an arcade game Atari released in 1979 that places players in control of a triangle-shaped spacecraft in the middle of a field of drifting asteroids. The player's goal is to destroy these asteroids by firing bullets at them. By hitting these space rocks, they will shatter into two smaller pieces. Each of these will in turn split into two small pieces that will be completely obliterated when shot. Once players clear the screen, a new wave of asteroids appear, more numerous than the previous wave. If players dawdle, two different UFOs will begin showing up. A large UFO will float around firing randomly, while a tiny UFO will deliberately target the player. Every 10,000 points, the player earns an extra ship, and if they set a high score, Asteroids lets them enter in their initials, one of the earliest games to do so. The player's ship can maneuver around the screen using its thruster, and in a pinch, the player can activate hyperspace, which will either drop them at a random location on the screen, or destroy their ship on re-entry. All the while, a thumping bassline reflects the player's heartbeat, increasing in frequency as the wave goes on before resetting back down to a sedate frequency once the new wave begins. The coin-op original version of Asteroids was a co-production between hardware engineer Howard Delman, the vice president of the coin-op game development Lyle Raines, and programmer Ed Logg. In a 1998 interview with historian Keith Smith, Raines said that the game's creation was inspired by the success of Space Invaders. As described in my video about that VCS release, Space Invaders was a massive hit in Japan and to a somewhat lesser extent in the West. Raines wanted a game that had the same idea of shooting moving objects on screen, but expanded that concept to include more freedom of movement. Logg, who had previously worked on Dennis Cobal's game Avalanche, was available, and Raines recruited him to help build out his game concept. Raines said that he described to him an idea where a spaceship maneuvered around the playfield akin to the player's ship in computer space, shooting asteroids that would split into smaller pieces. Logg, in an interview with David Craddock, remembers it being more of a brainstorming session and that he himself had come up with the idea of splitting asteroids, as well as the idea for attacking UFOs, dubbed Mr. Bill and Sluggo by the developers after the Saturday Night Live characters, to help prevent players from taking too long on a wave. Logg said he proposed using vector hardware for this game concept, previously used by Atari's Lunar Lander coin-op title, having seen how well Victor graphics worked for this sort of space game in Cinematronic's Space Wars machine. Logg told Craddock that the increased resolution that vector hardware offered would make it easier to see where the ship was aiming, and that the distinct vector trails left by the ship, asteroids, and bullets would add another layer of visual appeal, although this last point was not an intentional part of the game's design. While Logg developed the game logic, Delman told historian Scott Stilfen that he handled the audio, generated through discrete logic circuits, and improved the vector generator used by the game. An array of other technicians, engineers, and designers helped produce the final product, but the three of them were the heart of the game's creation, Delman added. For actually developing the hardware, Delman literally used a Lunar Lander circuit board as the baseline, making modifications through an add-on board that would tweak the hardware to run Asteroids successfully. Once the hardware design was finalized for the game, Delman said Atari struck a unique Asteroids PCB that was used in its production run. The Strong Museum of Play holds a great deal of Atari's coin-op division paper records, and this includes a number specifically about asteroids. Aside from early game planning forms that describe the game essentially as produced, the Strong holds several documents describing Asteroids' focus group and location test breakdowns. For the focus testing, Atari brought in two groups, one of older players that primarily were interested in Space Wars, and another of teenagers that mainly played Space Invaders. The teenagers were more interested in asteroids, though both groups liked it. The game's array of buttons for controls were a bit confusing, as were the objectives. The report indicates some players initially thought the goal was to avoid the rocks and fire at saucers. Maneuvering was also a skill that players had difficulty getting the hang of, as the ship in Asteroids does drift, but also has a friction that eventually slows it to a stop. In its location test at the old Sacramento Time Zone arcade, Asteroids was considered by the players interviewed to be an above-average game. Not as good as Lunar Lander, Starship One, or Space Invaders. That said, repeat players really liked the skill and dexterity Asteroids required, and perhaps more importantly, the game was a very good earner during its mid-September test period. Asteroids made its debut at the Amusement and Music Operators Association convention in November 1979, with sales starting about the same time. Coin-Op Trade Playmeter referred to it as one of the more promising video games on the show floor, with some of the same appeal behind Space Invaders supporting it. At the same time, writer Dick Whaley was not impressed by it, being a bigger fan of Cinematronics' Tail Gunner. Whaley was clearly in a minority, however, as Asteroids became a monster hit for Atari on par with Space Invaders, cementing coin-op video games as a lucrative arena for operators and, alongside the previous year's Space Invaders, kicked off the Golden Age arcade fad. The game hit #1 on Replay magazine's popularity charts in April 1980 and remained there for the next year. If Japan had the Invader boom, the West had its own powerful love affair with Asteroids. According to a production document, Atari built nearly 48,000 upright machines and another 8,700 cocktail table cabinets, as well as an unspecified number of smaller cabaret cabs. In a note held by the Strong Museum, engineer Gary Bailey indicated that by the time production stopped in 1980, Atari had produced 70,000 units overall for the entire globe. To celebrate this success, Atari had a special Golden Anniversary Asteroids at its Stargate 80 presentation at the 1980 AMOA. With an average playtime of about 75 seconds, at least until players learned the scoring tricks that allowed experts to essentially play it until they decided to stop, the game was a top-notch earner for location owners. A survey published by Cashbox in November 1980 found Asteroids to be the top earner among operators, surpassing Midway's Galaxian and the Williams pinball machine Firepower. In fact, 40% of all surveyed indicated if they had to pick only one machine to make them money, it would be Asteroids. Replay magazine surveys indicated that effectively 100% of operators had an Asteroids cabinet under their belt, and the game won the Industry Trade's 1980 Game of the Year. According to author Craig Kuby in his 1982 title, The Winner's Book of Video Games, and it should be noted that Kuby had direct access to Atari staff for his work. Asteroids pulled in between $700 and $800 million in its best 12-month period, more than the life earnings of not just any other video game or pinball machine, but by his count, more than any movie, book, or record had brought in by that point. Asteroids, alongside other arcade smash hits Space Invaders, Defender, and Pac-Man, also appear to have headlined the nascent video game strategy book industry. Beyond Kuby's title, there were several others that professed strategies to help players earn high scores and stay on the machine longer. In Asteroids' case, this comes down to Ufo Hunting. The player reduces the number of asteroids on screen down to a few slow-moving ones that ideally are traveling mostly vertically, then hangs out near one of the corners to pick off UFOs as they spawn before they can get a shot off. Of course, since players were quickly mastering the game well enough to stay on for long periods, Atari developed a modification that would make the UFOs fire immediately at higher scores, making the UFO hunting strategy far more dangerous. Other mod kits existed that sped up the game to similarly keep players challenged. Kuby wrote in his book about an alternative approach that he discovered at the Circus Casino in Reno, where the girl succeeding with it would fly vertically up the middle of the screen and fire shots off at the saucers as they spawned, both making it harder to hit them, while also making it much harder for them to hit her. He suggested that it appeared to be still effective even on modded machines. In May 1981, Atari released Asteroids Deluxe, a more difficult sequel/expansion of the original game that had expanded code by Dave Shepard. In addition to featuring the more aggressive UFOs from the modified version of the original Asteroids, Deluxe introduces killer satellites that break apart and hone in on the player's ship, dramatically improves the accuracy of both UFOs, and swaps out hyperspace for a shield function that wears out from taking hits and from overuse. Deluxe was essentially designed to defeat those who'd mastered the original Asteroids, and while it was popular, it never reached the same heights as its predecessor, with about 22,000 units produced. Another sequel, Space Duel, came along the following year in February 1982, after lengthy delays. According to historian Keith Smith, its original developer, Rick Moore, the same person behind the VCS games Space Invaders and Maze Craze, reportedly suffered a nervous breakdown, halting work. In its stead, Asteroids Deluxe went out. When Asteroids Deluxe failed to meet Atari's expectations, Space Duel was revived with Owen Rubin finishing up the game. This multiplayer take on Asteroids allowed 2 players to play at once, though Atari was reportedly disappointed with it only selling 12,000 units, a success by most companies' standards but not Atari's for an Asteroids sequel. All this is to say that Asteroids was a huge deal for Atari and for arcade video games in general, and as a result it was a no-brainer for Atari's home systems, the VCS and its 400 and 800 computer line. For the VCS version, developer Brad Stewart took on the task of trying to translate a game that, at first glance, is ill-suited to the VCS. After all, the console is not capable of the high-resolution visuals of the arcade game, and the hardware is really not suited for letting an increasing number of space rocks float in all directions. Nevertheless, Stewart found a way to make it work. In an interview for Paleotronic, Stewart's fellow developer Rob Fulop said that the breakthrough came early on while the two of them were at lunch, discussing how one would convert Asteroids and Missile Command to the VCS. Fulop said Stewart had the idea of flickering the graphics every other frame. This way, the player's ship, the UFOs, and any bullets would appear on the playfield one frame, and the blocky asteroids would appear on the next frame. This became the foundation for the game's engine and is a major reason why it works on the VCS at all. Since the VCS has a much easier time allowing objects to move vertically than horizontally, the asteroids always have pretty steady vertical momentum either up or down the screen, along with varying degrees of horizontal movement depending on how they're shot and what game type the cartridge is set to. The UFOs return from the arcade version, behaving in much the same way as they do there. Since the screen is smaller, players can only shoot 2 bullets at a time, half the number the arcade game allows. They also disappear much faster. While the arcade game maxes out at 10 large rocks eventually, the VCS take limits that to 8. The joystick replaces the all-button control panel from the arcade game. Players can push up to begin thrusting, though the friction is radically reduced in this version, making it easy to start flying out of control. Finally, pulling down on the joystick will activate a special function. Depending on the game type, players have access to hyperspace, which here will not randomly destroy your ship, a shield a la Asteroids Deluxe, which will explode your ship if used too long, a flip, which shifts your ship's nose 180 degrees, or simply nothing at all. And oh, are there a lot of variations on this cartridge, 66 in all. In addition to your ship's special functions, the game types will adjust whether the asteroids move slowly or quickly, and if you gain extra lives at 5,000, 10,000, or 20,000 points, or simply never. There's also the now common Children's mode, which feature a maximum of 4 slow asteroids that only break into one piece, hyperspace functionality, and extra lives every 5,000 points. All of these are available in 1 and 2 player modes. Finally, flipping the difficulty switch over to A will activate the UFOs, which otherwise do not spawn. If you want to play a variation most closely resembling the arcade experience, you'll want games 4 or 37 with the UFOs active, but there are enough options here to tailor the experience to your own skill level. On the whole, the VCS conversion of Asteroids is pretty solid. As I've talked about previously, the best home versions of arcade games try to distill what makes the original appealing and retain those core elements. And while Asteroids suffers from the hardware gap more than, say, Space Invaders, it's close enough. The game's weird mobility encourages the player to limit how much thrust they use to get around, to the point where often the best strategy is simply to stay put in your starting position. This is even more important when you clear a wave, as the new asteroids will spawn immediately on the sides of the screen, and if you're outside the middle third, there's a very good chance you'll get destroyed immediately. The different special function options all change how you approach the game, too. Hyperspace may not have the risk of imploding your ship, but if the screen is crowded enough, it's still an incredibly risky maneuver given the size of the playfield and the asteroids themselves. The shield option renders your ship completely invincible and intangible, so there's no bouncing around like in Asteroids Deluxe, and this allows for a distinct defensive playstyle. As long as you don't overdo it, you can stay safe when UFOs fire at your ship, or when rocks come way too close for comfort. In contrast, the 180-degree flip is designed for offense. You don't have good defensive choices with this ability, so instead you want to just constantly ensure nothing is coming close to you on your rear. And having none of these options forces you to just play as safe as possible. That said, playing safe can be tricky. The slow asteroid game types do allow you to get sloppier since the rocks are rarely the same degree of threat as they are in the fast game types, but they're still huge and numerous. Mercifully, unlike the arcade game, the UFOs spawn at about a 50-50 rate, whereas the arcade heavily weighs in favor of the small, more dangerous UFO. Being able to adjust how often you get extra lives also changes the game in subtle ways. You can get way more aggressive when lives are coming in every 5,000 points than you can if they're only showing up every 20,000 or never. Asteroids has the distinction of being the first Atari VCS game to come out in an 8KB cartridge. This necessitated some engineering on Atari's part, as the VCS's cartridge port lacked the necessary pin connectors to include a read-write line. The initial pitch for what's known as bank-switched carts came from Bob Whitehead while working alongside Larry Wagner on Atari's video chess cartridge. In a 2018 interview with myself, Whitehead said that they wanted to make their chess game more competitive after seeing the popular Sargon chess in action. Sargon was considered the gold standard in chess programs at the time, and while they didn't think the VCS could beat it, the two recognized that if they had more cartridge space, they could produce a more competitive game. After a series of meetings and discussions with management, Whitehead said the company ultimately decided to ship it as a 4K cartridge. But after he'd left Atari in 1979, the company started developing the custom chips that'd be necessary to go above the 4K limit. Stewart indicated in a 2001 interview with Scott Stilfen that Carl Nielsen's LSI chip design group took on the project, and Nielsen was credited as the inventor when the patent was granted in 1983. The basic explanation for bank switching, according to Stewart, is that the developer will split code up between two banks of ROM space, and then add in code that tells the computer to look at the other bank for necessary data. Every VCS game over 4 kilobytes in size uses this technique, and Asteroids became the first such game because the game was simply too big. Stewart said that he and fellow developer Bob Smith spent a lot of time going over the code to shrink it, but were unable to get it to fit on a standard cartridge, necessitating the move to 8K. At the 2016 Portland Retro Gaming Expo, Smith and Stewart believed it was the collision detection that was causing problems, as it was taking so long to get through everything in the game that the program would miss the tight window it had for calculations before it had to start drawing the screen again, resulting in a rolling picture. Stewart told me that management had no pushback or issue whatsoever with using an 8K cartridge for Asteroids, as they simply wanted to get it shipped out as soon as possible. That said, he also didn't explore any enhancements that the extra space would have afforded, wanting to simply get the game off his plate himself. This even includes a black and white mode color palette. This is the first VCS game, not counting Magicard, which is more of a programming tool, where the black and white switch does nothing at all. This isn't to say that the game doesn't run in grayscale on a black and white set, but you don't really get any shades specifically chosen for it. Presumably this was another space-saving cut that wasn't re-added when the game moved to 8K. Strangely enough, there is a ROM revision for Asteroids that adds a copyright screen. Stewart said this wasn't one of his additions, so someone else must have added it to the game. Interestingly, while the lives counter on the retail release is a simple number, Stewart did program in a visual display similar to the arcade game where your extra lives are lined up at the top of the screen. Stewart does not remember why this was disabled in the final game, but posits that it may have been part of a space-saving effort to fit Asteroids into 4K that he simply never re-implemented when he got the approval to move to 8K. Modern hacks, such as the superb Asteroids DC Plus put together in 2002, exist that reactivate this visual display, and it does bring the game a little bit closer to its arcade counterpart. Based on that hack, Stewart also limited the angles that the rocks themselves can fly around to keep the game's difficulty in check. Atari first announced the home version of Asteroids shortly before the winter 1981 Consumer Electronics Show, and newspaper ads show stores were taking orders for it as early as February. Even more boggling, in the Video Magazine review of the cartridge, Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz wrote that some stores were taking $5 deposits for Asteroids as far back as December 1980. Asteroids was hotly anticipated, they wrote, though its initial impressions at trade shows left something to be desired. The colorful, low-res visuals were one thing, but at that moment the two wrote that the asteroids were only moving up or down based on which side of the screen they were on. The final version, on the other hand, was considered a major triumph by the authors, gushing about the options and the fluidity of gameplay. They'd go on to hand it Game of the Year for the 3rd annual Archie Awards the following January. QB wrote in his book that while the home version looks and plays very differently from its arcade counterpart, by home gaming standards it is an outstanding effort, surpassing the arcade game with its variations, if not its gameplay. QB indicates that the game started shipping to retailers in July, though the earliest ads I've seen for it have it for sale at the start of August, so it's likely units didn't arrive at stores until the very end of the month at the earliest. Asteroids had a respectable first year, selling just over 407,000 units in 1981, fewer than Warlords, Breakout, Night Driver, and Space Invaders, but nevertheless good numbers given when it came out and the new technology powering the cartridge. According to QB's Winner's Book of Video Games, Atari's entire initial production run was spoken for with pre-orders alone. More than 1.3 million copies were sold in 1982, though net sales in 1983 fell to a negative 100,000 units, indicating that Atari had more returns than sales that year as the market contracted. Sales data for the later half of the 1980s show that Asteroids was a steady but not stellar seller, selling 44,292 units between 1986 and 1990. Asteroids was Atari's 10th bestseller, but it appears that the anticipation for the game before its release had some limits. It's likely that the game's limited quantities earlier on played a factor, and as time went on, Asteroids as a game just got long in the tooth. Of special note is the Starplex controller for the VCS though, a third-party controller that matches up with the control panel layout for the arcade version of Asteroids. This features a nice turbo function and simple button controls, so while it's ideal for Asteroids, quite a few other games that rely mainly on left and right movement play well with this device too. Atari itself would use the VCS port in its 1981 International Asteroids Tournament, held that fall in 25 regional tournaments across 12 countries, with the grand finals taking place in Washington, D.C. that December. The competition was ultimately won by Andy Breyer of Schaumburg, Illinois, who took home $5,000 and a medal. That said, regional victors also got their own Asteroids Deluxe arcade cabinet, admittedly a pretty cool prize in 1981. Asteroids inspired a few knockoffs, both on the VCS and on other home consoles. First up was Magnavox's Odyssey 2 game UFO, first advertised for sale around May 1981. UFO is an interesting twist on the formula laid out by Atari's game. Here, all the asteroids are replaced by UFOs, with some drifting randomly around, others homing in on the player, and a third kind actively firing at you, akin to the actual UFOs in Asteroids. Your ship is not the quick-turning vessel of Atari's game, but instead a chunky saucer that generates a protective shield. A white dot will rotate around the ship to aim in the direction the player is traveling, and pushing the button will cause it to fire your shield's energy as a laser beam. While your shield recharges, your ship is vulnerable and slowed. In practice, the ideal strategy in UFO is simply to ram the enemy vessels with your shield up, as this will guarantee their destruction, and if you're going to lose your shield anyway, you may as well. Kunkel and Katz reviewed this in an October 1981 video column, referring to it as one of the best home science fiction themed games available, praising in particular its audio and visual design. It ended up a runner-up in the 1981 Archie Awards Game of the Year, losing out to Asteroids, but it did take home the award for Best Science Fiction Game. Meanwhile, the folks at Mattel had a bit of a winding road to release for their Asteroids clone for the Intellivision. The initial game was called Meteors, and had players drifting around a looping playfield, firing at asteroids and occasional UFOs. Because Meteors was fairly small, developer John Soule added in a second game he called Avalanche, where the meteor objects would fall toward the surface and players had to destroy them or lose points. When Mattel's lawyers stepped in to indicate Meteors was way too similar to Asteroids for their comfort, Soule simply forked the code to automatically boot into Avalanche, renamed to Astro Smash. Astro Smash would go on to become one of the company's most popular Intellivision games, taking over as the pack-in title with the console for the 1982 holiday season. Meteors itself, in its original form, would go unreleased until 1998's Intellivision Lives game collection, but the code wasn't simply abandoned. Instead, Meteors was handed to a new developer, Bill Fisher, as his training game at Mattel. He was asked to take Soule's work and tweak it to be different enough from Asteroids that it could be released. What he came up with was Spacehawk, a 1982 game where players assume the role of an astronaut with a jetpack, floating around a playfield firing at comets and alien ships. Players can press a button to shift between drift and direct movement modes, essentially allowing the astronaut to drift around like the ship in Asteroids or only move while the thrusters are active. Similarly, another set of buttons allows players to change aiming styles from simply jumping your gun to whatever direction is pressed on the controller disc to rotating like the ship in Asteroids. Taking a hit will lose the player one of their 5 shields and send them into an uncontrolled spin. Finally, there is a hyperspace button that will warp your character around the screen but will cost you points in the process. With a variety of targets and some additional complexity over Soul's original work, Spacehawk is distinct enough to have its own appeal unique from Asteroids. In a particularly cute way to resolve a bug in the program, occasionally your astronaut will warp elsewhere on the screen at the cost of some points even without pushing the hyperspace button. This is due to how the Intellivision reads controller inputs, as sometimes the directional disc and the fire button will be read as the hyperspace button. Since this isn't really fixable, the solution Fisher and his boss, Mike Minkoff, came up with was to simply add a blurb to the manual about invisible black holes that will randomly appear and warp the player around. Playing them back to back, it's clear where Spacehawk pulls from Meteors and how Fisher diverged the gameplay to pass muster with Mattel's legal department, and ultimately, the game was stronger for it. Meteors is a fairly bland experience, but there's enough variety in Spacehawk to make it worthwhile. Back on the VCS, former Atari staffers Bob Brown and Craig Nelson had formed the third-party company Arcadia, renamed shortly thereafter to Starpath, and engineered the Supercharger. The Supercharger could be considered bank switch hardware on steroids, boasting 6 kilobytes of built-in memory and allowing the company to produce games on cassette tape instead of cartridges. This kept costs down and allowed them to produce games far more complex than stock VCS games could be. And naturally, one of the first games they'd released was Suicide Mission, an Asteroids clone where players are fighting bacteria inside a human bloodstream. Using the same Venetian blinds graphical technique seen in video chess, developers Stephen Landrum and Steve Hales were able to create relatively high-resolution visuals that invoked the feeling of a vector monitor without actually being one. The original prototype, Meteoroids, was even closer to Atari's arcade game, however, featuring the same inertial drift and similar rock shapes as the original. Both versions of the game do away with hyperspace in favor of a shield that slowly cools down when not in use. The UFO equivalents will also eschew firing on the player in favor of ramming them, while the asteroids will slowly spawn over time. This does make the game distinctive from Asteroids, though not enough that it's unrecognizable. Perhaps the most well-regarded of all these home clones would be Mindstorm, the built-in game on the GCE Vectrex. Since the Vectrex is a built-in vector monitor, there are zero concerns over trying to handle a lower-resolution raster TV display. Mindstorm was developed by John Hall, who, according to his website roadsidethoughts.com, was a game developer at Western Technologies when GCE contracted them to produce some software for the Vectrex. Hall wrote this built-in game while his coworkers Paul Allen Newell and Mark Indictor worked on Scramble and Star Trek, respectively. On his last day at Western Technologies, Hall finished Mindstorm and left for GCE proper, alongside Indictor. Hall's game has all the major components of Asteroids: the ship, the hyperspace button, the playfield, but handles everything else in a unique manner. The titular mines don't break apart when shot, but rather spawn 2 smaller mines from the background, each of which will spawn 2 more yet smaller mines. While this may seem like the same thing Asteroids does, the fact that you can see where the new mines will spawn in means you have to be mindful of your positioning while clearing the screen. Every so often a UFO will appear, but instead of firing at your ship, it'll simply drop off more mines. As the player clears waves, new kinds of mines begin to enter the fray. Some will slowly drift towards the player, some will shoot out a fireball when destroyed that in turn must be avoided or shot, and others will combine both of these elements. It's quite an achievement, honestly. Mindstorm is clearly an Asteroids clone and it retains that game's appeal, but it's also unique enough that it has a draw all its own. There was no way Atari was licensing out Asteroids to GCE, but this is a top-notch knockoff. Mindstorm actually has 3 different code revisions. Revision B fixes a high score bug and to Hall's knowledge was never included with Vectrex units, while Revision C is better known under the name Mindstorm 2. The original Mindstorm built into the Vectrex has a bug where after the 13th wave, the game would crash. Hall writes on his website that once he learned of the crash in December 1982, he went home and worked overnight to fix the bug and make a few other code changes, including writing a wave table up to wave 256, at which point the game would start over. Dropping off the new code at the GCE office the next morning, Hall was told by a surprised Lee Chaden that it would likely have to wait for a new production run of Vectrexes. In reality, the code found its way into the Mindstorm 2 cartridges that were mailed out to anyone who called and complained about the crash bug. 1983 brought with it Blastroids for the Bally Professional Arcade. Published in July by indie developer Esoterica, Blastroids starts players off in an arena where robots are defending force fields under construction. Destroying the robots will take you to the next wave, while touching them or the force fields costs you a life. Later stages introduce maze elements, where the player must make their way through corridors of force fields to destroy the robots, hiding behind a slowly closing door. I can't speak to these stages personally, however, as even the early stages are incredibly difficult. This is still a pretty nifty cart and a neat twist on the Asteroids formula on its own, just don't expect to make much progress at it until you get a better feel for the game's speed. And Atari itself revisited Asteroids a few more times over the years. A conversion for the Atari 400 and 800 computers was published around September 1981, and it certainly plays alright, if pretty slow. This particular port was supposed to be re-released for the Atari 5200, but never actually came out. As it turns out, the 5200's analog sticks, which do not center themselves, are an incredibly bad combination with a game that requires deft maneuvering and aiming. While a prototype exists, it doesn't take much time with the game to understand that the decision to shelve it was the right call. 5200 owners interested in the game would instead have to go for Meteorites, released by Electric Concepts in July 1984. Meteorites certainly plays much better than Atari's unreleased Asteroids, but the joystick still works against you nonetheless. Asteroids for the Atari 7800, on the other hand, is an excellent conversion and about as good as you can get for a system of its vintage. All the elements of the arcade are here. Space rocks drifting every which way, the UFO behavior, the number of objects, and to an extent, the fidelity. This is coupled with a few very cool two-player modes and great animation. Originally developed under the working title 3D Asteroids, Asteroids was supposed to come out alongside the 7800 for its July 1984 test launch, but after Atari's consumer division was sold off to Jack Tramiel, 7800 would sit in limbo as he and Warner negotiated who would pay the developer GCC for these launch games and, more importantly, the 7800 hardware itself, which GCC had developed. Asteroids would finally see the light of day in 1986. While it is no less impressive that year, Asteroids was a 7-year-old game by then, and the arcade boom had long since faded. Still, looking back at it in 2022, it's a fine showcase of what the 7800 hardware brought to the table if the system had been able to keep its original timeline. It's also worth briefly bringing up Space Rocks, a VCS homebrew game that converts Asteroids and Asteroids Deluxe with all of the options of the original VCS port, and then some. It's a remarkable feat that takes advantage of some modern programming techniques and technology to run on the console. And if you're the sort of person who's into Atari homebrew games, this does neatly surpass Stewart's version across the board in terms of arcade accuracy. This is, incidentally, Atari's last release of 1981, at least the last one published under their own label. Other than the next game to drop on the platform exclusively through Sears, the rest of 1981 will be filled with third-party games. That said, Atari had plans to put out at least one new VCS game each month of 1982, so they were certainly hard at work at this time. In October, the company reported that its supply of VCS consoles and games for retailers had essentially been sold out since March, and it's likely that with that kind of supply constraint, the company saw no reason to bump up anything else it may have had ready by the Christmas season. Asteroids has had a few more appearances over the years, such as a rather faithful and solid mid-90s remake published by Activision, and the recent Asteroids Recharged on modern platforms. You can even find homages to it in titles like Battletoads Double Dragon, which includes a stage where players fly little spaceships around shooting at asteroids and UFOs. That said, while Asteroids may be one of the most iconic games for Atari in general, it's also arguably the most popular game to ever use the mechanics first introduced in Space War back in 1962. An overhead spaceship maneuvering through a playfield with other objects to contend with. So in that regard, Asteroids is part of a pretty rich legacy. This home port, while popular in its day, never seemed to gain the same mindshare as the original did, but it's still worth revisiting on its own merits. This is one of the most recognizable games in the VCS library, and one of the biggest releases of 1981. Next time, we return to Sears for some brick breaking.